Today I'm going to be talking to you about network APIs, and more specifically, northbound APIs. And so looking at what's the revenue opportunity for telcos, what's happening today, where is that sweet spot, what that ecosystem looks like, what are the different models, and then sort of a little bit of a what next. So, just a few questions that we're going to touch on, but we'll save some questions to the end. So, the big number, I'm going to flash this up really quick. What we've done is essentially look at the market size for northbound APIs, looking at a collection of, I think it's 11 here, 11 different northbound APIs. So all of this market sizing has been informed by, I think, survey programs with about 400 or 500 developers. We've done about 80 or so interviews with telcos, with developers, developer platforms, some of the aggregators, hyperscalers, all across the board to essentially build a view of what the opportunity is. And now I'm going to caveat that a lot of this is subject to a number of different factors, right? I think someone mentioned there about regulation and, issues, for example, with, let's say, net slicing. We've obviously got certain challenges around not just the technical availability of some of these APIs, but also commercial availability. How will this go on? But we've built that into this model. We've also looked at, the degree of, let's say, that opportunity that's addressable by, directly by CSPs or by aggregators, for example. But I'm going to try this. There we go. You can see that, by 2028, it is, a pretty sizable number, and that's sort of our prediction on this. We can also see that specifically with regards to the edge node discovery there, we've coupled this with our edge market sizing model, and you can see that based on our predictions, the actual MEC-specific APIs will account for about a quarter of the edge connectivity revenues for 2028. What the issue is, though, as I mentioned, is the fact that today it's still very early. When we were doing our primary research with developers across all sorts of different use cases, from cloud gaming to various video analytics ones, some of the industrial ones, drones, so on and so forth. And the issue is there's a group of application developers or applications that see the network as a means of competitive differentiation. It's either a way of significantly enhancing the way they deliver that application, or it's something that enables something that they weren't able to do previously. And we're seeing the emergence of different developers or applications that now have a certain degree of network awareness, or to some degree, some early network intelligence within this. But at the same time, there are a whole host of other, the long tail of developers who see this as nice to have, don't really think about connectivity, are happy with best efforts, or even in some cases are happy with finding other ways to work around the issues with best efforts connectivity. So I guess the question is now then, where's the sweet spot? What are the potential use cases or areas that really require the need for some of these network APIs? So what we've done then is look at different use cases and looked at how we can map them across a number of areas. So here you can see on the left, we've got sort of a local area and then more so to the wide area. Then we look at use case applicability or use case nature, if you will. Is this something that is a non-real-time use case where, it's as and when we get that information or an insight, so and so, or is this a lot more mission critical? Does this require, that sub 10 millisecond latency? And so what we've seen is that actually with a lot of the use cases that I cited here, a lot of that focus for these mission critical use cases, typically, industrial sites, so on and so forth, there's a big focus there actually on private networks and on-premise edge. So there's been certain talks and, we've had discussions with a number of different players, and a few of them mentioned things like, AGVs or certain moving things around a campus. But actually, when we speak to the application providers, a lot of that compute is actually done either on the device itself or offloaded to an on-premise edge. And therefore, it kind of almost means that the need for, let's say, an edge node discovery API or, quality of service API isn't as required because there's more of a case there for private networks and on-premise edge. Then if we go to sort of this bottom area here where it's, non-real-time use cases, there's a few of them, and of course, to some extent, we are generalizing. There are some exceptions, and I'll name some of those exceptions. But for a lot of cases, there are others where actually best efforts is good enough, where if you are collecting a lot of data, for example, from various sensors, they're happy to wait till, let's say the train or the vehicle docks at a certain location or parks up, has access to, that connectivity again, and then uploads that data, gets that analyzed, and then insights are used. So we cite a few examples here as well. Or in some cases, some of the areas that are perhaps not necessarily super non-real time, but sort of fall in the middle here. For example, we've got some, quite a few discussions with various, industrial AR, VR type of solution providers. Well, actually, to some extent, they said, should something fail, they have some degree of storage anyway within their device that, stores the absolute, critical insights. So then what we found actually is if you look at then the real-time use cases where it is sort of in a wide area, then that's where we found a lot greater interest and exploration into the role of connectivity in enabling these applications. So you can see here, cloud gaming. I think, Mark, you mentioned that earlier, let's say on a train. We know that, there are some certain gamers who are willing to pay for that extra, although I guess the business model is something we'll discuss a little bit later. Certain video analytics use cases as well, video distribution, where you might need to figure out, let's say, where the most optimal edge node is to place that workload. Drone navigation is a big one as well, where we've been speaking to a number of different drone delivery companies, especially for things like medical supplies. That's another one. And also immersive experiences, where we've seen this in, let's say, particularly some of the bigger events. Then what I wanted to cover next is looking at what that ecosystem looks like. And I know this term aggregators gets thrown around a lot. And actually what we found is that there are multiple different forms of aggregation. So for example, if you're looking at an industrial site in pulling together different partners, making everything works, that form of aggregation comes in the form of an SI, right? But then at the same time, what about, the Vonages and Twilios and, Ring Centrals of the world who are, CPaaS platforms anyway? What about, the hyperscalers? Are they more supply-side API aggregators, as we call them, because they have that sort of, ubiquity across the market, the edge market, for example? Or are they, to some degree as well, in other parts of their business, are they more demand-side distributors? What about, IoT device management platforms? They're also sort of a key partner in this space when you talk about, okay, well, what if you want to use a device location or a device information API? Then, it's not always the developer itself or the enterprise. So I think this is sort of exploring then what is, what are the different routes to market for a telco? And, I want to say it depends. It's a bit of a cop-out answer, but it depends on a use case by use case basis. We tell this to our clients as well, and you can see here that, the majority of a lot of these models are more wholesale models. And that's not to say that, the opportunity isn't significant as well through that wholesale market, but at the same time, we do recognize and we do classify certain types of APIs as being much more retail-centric than, for example, A2P SMS APIs, which are highly commoditized, highly driven through, the companies, as I mentioned as well, Vonage, Twilios of the world. So then how can we look at the rest of the APIs and say, okay, well, what does that business model look like? What is sort of that revenue breakdown across these different partners then? And speaking to, as I mentioned, that developer or end customer community, we did ask as well, who, and this is across, I think, maybe about 10 or 12 different use cases. This is global, by the way. And we said, okay, well, if you were to consume a network API, and we've defined this quite broadly because sometimes when you say the word network API, it's not, you're not met with a nod of understanding, if you will. We asked, okay, well, with this ability to provide more information about the network or instructability of the network services you're consuming, which partner would you prefer to work with in this instance? And you can see here that actually, a lot of the partners there, do I have to click ahead? Yep. Where's the, okay, well, here it should say the hyperscalers. And I think the second one were more like some of the developer platforms and demand-side distribution platforms or demand-side aggregators, if you will. And then telcos were in this third bucket here, which is, maybe about second or third ranked in the list. And so I think that really sort of paints a picture in terms of, how telcos should really be working and continue to work. I know this is happening already, case in point with what Mark mentioned earlier with the work that they're doing with the Open Gateway and also with AWS. But, it tells you a lot in terms of how, the different channels, if you will. So I'm conscious of time, just to wrap up as well. So, across a lot of yesterday's sessions and today's sessions as well, a lot of the conversation has been, well, what is really required to make this whole concept of greater network programmability and instructability available to external customers, whether that be developers or enterprises. And so, as we mentioned, it's the sense of ease, right? The ability to do this in a highly flexible way, highly automated way. This requires not just, I guess, sort of exposing this to partners, but you kind of have to get the internal plumbing correct, right? You have to get it working, you have to get that dynamic enough to be able to even expose to external customers. And so what we found is a lot of operators are even using, let's say, internal customers, like certain lines of business, their B2B business, B2C, or B2B to X, as a means of, testing this out in a way, in a safer environment, before then exposing that to external customers. Then the issue then is, for example, this pay-as-you-need basis. A lot of developers at the moment are not willing to subscribe to let's say, a monthly usage contract. A lot of them say, well, we're just testing this at the moment. We don't necessarily know the value, and therefore, sometimes we just need a pay-as-you-need. It might only be a certain percentage of our devices that need this. And so we want to be able to test this. We then want to be able to scale this based on that demand. And also here, talking a little bit further about sort of the networks and applications as well, but I'll jump onto this in this next slide. I know a lot of my presentation is focused on northbound APIs, but all of this really depends on, as I mentioned, that plumbing, the east-west APIs, the southbound APIs, so that you can sort of communicate and interact with actually what you need from the network infrastructure. And also a big issue is at the moment is also how do you manage this whole, as this opportunity scales, how do you manage the whole issue of, I don't know how we want to call it, but roaming, right? If you are a customer that is going from one area within the same country even, let's say the US, one area to another, how do you ensure that continuity of that service from a customer point of view? Because they're not going to care if it's, well, provided by Verizon or T-Mobile, whatever. If they're playing that game and, taking Amtrak, not that I know about Amtrak, but if they're taking Amtrak from one state to another, then how do they ensure that actually I can still play my game, that I'm still getting that quality of service, I'm still able to, as we mentioned, whether through Discord, able to communicate with other gamers who are playing at that current moment. And so the other thing I wanted to touch on as well, don't know why that's so small, but is the fact that arguably, I think a lot of operators that we have spoken to, particularly sort of in the global scale, are saying, well, we're waiting for 5GSA. And there are various reasons to this. A is because of the network exposure function. B is because trying to build these or develop these APIs and make that readily available with existing infrastructure, there are issues to that as well. But actually, we argue that there are some of them, maybe perhaps a more basic, network information type of APIs that are valuable, and we see that already, and there are evolutions to that. For example, perhaps if this, quality of service on demand API is tricky for some, then there is still value that developers see in just having basic network information. How is the quality of my connection, so on and so forth. But you can see there, sorry, I see some people squinting. The yellow there is, I'm trying to squint now, is yes, we are collecting information on very basic network indicators. So this one here. And then here is we collect information but it's not through an API. It is just inferring based on the limited information that they have. And then obviously there's the big no here, but then a certain timeline to that. So, just to quickly summarize, as I mentioned, there is an opportunity. There's a significant one as well. We see that growing. We see that coming. There is a question a little bit in terms of that chicken and egg, but there is no question that demand has to come from greater collaboration with the telecoms community, with the developer community as well. As I mentioned as well, that sweet spot really is where you need reliable, real-time insight and reliable connectivity across wider areas where this will drive demand. Operators, again, need to think about sort of the multiple distribution channels. These are very use case specific, so I don't want to say, bank on one, bank on the other. And then, more importantly, it's also making sure, well, there's a certain degree of work in the background in terms of the degree of automation, that degree of sort of cloudification as well, to make sure that you can expose these APIs securely, reliably, and safely as well for customers. But thank you.
Thank you, Yesmean. It can be such a complex topic, the network APIs, and difficult to get your head around. And there's such a great, succinct overview, clearly explaining what this opportunity is for operators. And are there any questions for Yesmean? I have one. What is your sense of the awareness amongst developers, as you're doing your research and reaching out to them, that these kinds of APIs are going to be available, or what they can do with them?
So what I didn't quite mention is that of the survey program with, I think I said about 400 or 500 developers, we disqualified about 800-900. And the reason being for disqualifying those responses is because once you see those responses, you can tell they have no idea what a network API is. And that's very telling. And also, you can see as well from a lot of the conversations that we've been having with developers themselves, some of them may have a relevant background that warrants sort of greater understanding of what the role the network can play in enabling applications. but others are just exploring. They might have had a conversation, here or there with an operator, for example, and heard something about 5G. That's often a big trigger. But at the same time, we are seeing a lot of different application providers who are slowly looking to leverage that. We can see that from annual reports. We can see that from discussions. They are sort of focused on, again, as I mentioned, a certain bucket of use cases, but they are coming.
Interesting. Great. Thank you. Any questions? I've got one here from you first.
So it's Mark Cornell from the GSMA. So what do you think is the best way of encouraging developers to try the APIs? How do we get them to try?
Yeah, I think the first thing is even having a conversation with them about sort of that art of the possible. But the second thing is also usability. It's accessibility, but B, usability. There are a lot of challenges, and perhaps the telecoms industry isn't that great compared to some of the more digital players in even providing that documentation around the APIs. To allow and to share. Okay, well, this is how you use it, and that's often the big challenge that we do find is that, as we mentioned, yes, there is a lot of work being done on standardization, and that's come a long way, and that will continue, hopefully, to progress. But at the same time, I think, a lot of developers say, at the moment, if we're going to consume one, a similar API, let's say from Verizon and another from AT&T, they work differently. And how do we as a developer make that work? And if you're a small company, how are you going to manage that burden? And therefore, I think that's why a lot of that channel preference ends up going to a much larger player, like the hyperscalers. But yes, usability, I'd say, and best practice.
I've got one more question here from Francis, please.
Great presentation. Apple Research, Francis Haysom. I'm interested in, you talked about the APIs and talking to developers. How much are we in danger of what I would say is imposing telco's view of what an API's developers want versus what development communities in very different areas, be it gaming, be it manufacturing, etc., are we in danger of projecting our view of what the APIs they want? And to leverage the comment Mark made earlier, which is, are we in danger of saying there are 10 APIs that the network provides, rather than saying the network provides capability that huge numbers of developers in very different communities that will need different things. I'm just interested in your view as to, are we just imposing a telco view on the rest of the world? And so when you ask a question, would you use this API? In reality, they're saying, I've got no idea why.
No, and I completely agree on that point. An API is not a thing that you buy, really. It's just a means of an outcome. It's, to get it straight, a lot of these, big digital companies, APIs are just a means to an end, right? And I think often I find that the telco industry is, and, I flashed out these market numbers, right? Of course, I'm in danger of that too, of saying, hey, these are monetizable. We can actually charge for these. Not all of these are, monetizable. And I think we have heard plenty of cases where telcos have developed an API thinking that that was what the customer wanted, in an RFP, for example, and then realizing that actually, they only wanted a means of collecting more information just to keep their providers accountable, just to understand, are they actually delivering what they are delivering? And that didn't need to be done through an API. And they did. They spent all this money, for example, I'm thinking of a very specific operator here. They spent all this money developing this API and trying to solve this need because they thought an API was the answer. But it isn't always the answer. And so I think we are still very much in danger of falling into that trap. And therefore, I think that's why a lot of these conversations and initiatives are important, to be able to have developers and the telco community sort of speak the same language.
That's great. Okay, I've got one more in the back, please.
Hi, the mic is just nearby, so I just mentioned. Thank you for the presentation, and from BT. We definitely want to see ourselves number 1, not number 3, because we are clubbing 1 and 2 and 3. The question I had was, we do hear a lot of similar tone discussions around, but we haven't really heard as to how do you categorize the developers and then analyze to see whether the developer community which really suits the telecom APIs are being targeted. So I really wanted to understand, have you done studies to really categorize developers very specific to the needs of a CSP and then try to see how we can develop those to bring in awareness first and then the rest can follow?
Yeah, we've done a few deep dives specifically on a number of the use cases and built sort of a very specific view of the different ecosystem players within that. And actually, you know, I must say, through the research, we have been surprised ourselves in terms of, you know, the heterogeneity, I would say, in different players and across those ecosystems, where you might even have, let's say, I'm thinking about, you know, video distribution. There are many different forms of partners, and that then eventually feed into, let's say, a video distribution platform provider, but the means of, let's say, engagement for a telco is still quite complex. It's not direct from telco to a video distribution management company to then work with, for example, the various broadcasters or ones who are providing the content itself. So I would say yes, we do have a number of cases that we specifically look at. These are not a comprehensive list, but you know, for us, it's a start, for sure.